No. What do you give me? Okay, so you're in. So now I'm going to make you host. And then you can let everybody else in and make Carrie co-host or something. You in and all that? It says you're host. Try making Carrie co-host and then it looks like you're doing everything because you just admitted everybody. So that's good.
All right. Thank you.
You're welcome. I'll see you in a couple of minutes.
Bye. Cool. Hello, everybody.
Hi.
We had a little bit of problem with Zoom for a second, but it is resolved. Mary, are you in Alaska yet?
No, leave on Sunday.
So fun. That sounds wonderful.
I'm so tired now getting ready. It's like.
All right. Hey.
Anybody else besides me cold?
Oh, yeah. Okay.
That's why I've got my sweater on.
Yeah, it's like, oh my goodness.
Sure about whether Scott's making it tonight or not. I can't remember with his travel plans, but anyway, let us begin the meeting at 6 o'clock for the Shutesbury Conservation Commission. Call it to order. And we have present Miriam DeFont, Mary David, Beth Wilson, and Robin Harrington. So we are going to just review the agenda for tonight. We're going to have Patrick Garner joining us at around 6:15 to talk about the bylaw regulations. So we'll just go through a couple of different short items before he joins us. And I think it'll be a simple meeting tonight. We don't have any public hearings for tonight. It's crazy. Yes. Oh, here's Scott. Hi, Scott. Welcome.
Hey there.
So we were just saying, Scott, that Patrick Garner is going to join us at 6:15 to talk about the bylaw regulations. But we just have a few items before that. Maybe we can tick those off pretty quickly. Carrie, if you could just let people in, that would be great. So we have the minutes from 5/11 to approve. Has everybody had a chance to review them?
Yep. Good to me.
Okay. Somebody want to make a
Motion to approve the minutes of 5/11.
second?
Second,
Okay, David,
Aye.
Font, I, Harrington,
aye.
Khan,
Hi.
Wilson.
I think I wasn't at that one.
Okay, so you're abstaining. We have a piece of unanticipated business that I was asked to give the Conservation Commission an update on. I attended a library building committee meeting on Tuesday night, and they would like to come to our next meeting with their consultant, their architect. They are looking for some ways to reduce some of this. There are people in the waiting room. Carrie, can you let them in? Okay. They are looking for some ways to reduce the costs because they're they're learning that the overall costs of the project are much higher than they expected. And one of the ways that's been suggested is to alter the location of the building itself, to move it closer to the road. The closer it is to the road, the less there's various expenses for electrical and other things. So they would like to get some preliminary feedback from the commission about our thoughts about it, because it moves it into the buffer zone for the two wetlands at the front of the property, but it also means that they're moving away from the buffer zone for BVW3, so they wouldn't be needing to remove trees the way that they were originally planning. So different kind of impacts, not, and they would like to just get some preliminary feedback from us. So I'm
Does it move it into the wetlands or just the buffer zone?
I believe it's all still buffer zone. I don't know the distances. I think they'll have some sort of schematic to share with us at that meeting. So we'll have something to look at with them. Okay. So I was just asked to bring that up and just let you guys know that. You can go listen to the recording if you want a more detailed discussion about that. And we got a notice from Penny Jakes that the restoration, BVW restoration work on Lot 032 is going to begin on Thursday, June 22nd. They're going to put up the erosion control sometime next week and let us know so we can go out and inspect them. And there was a question about whether or not we would require recording the order of conditions at the registry. Penny said there had been a past practice with municipal projects not require that, because the assumption was that those properties wouldn't be changing hands. And I haven't encountered this, so I wanted to bring it to the commission before I responded.
And what is it they want to do again?
The asking not to record it at the registry of deeds.
I've never heard of that before in
Yeah,
the
I
towns that
haven't
I've
either.
worked with.
They always record it.
Yes.
Yeah, I would think so, because you could sell, a town could conceivably, I mean, I know this isn't likely, but they could
Yeah.
sell property.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right, so we agreed that we would require it to be recorded, which is what the permit says currently.
Yeah.
All right, I will communicate that. All right, let me think about what else we have. I had some communication with Mark Stinson about having him come to a meeting to talk about what a bundled notice of intent for the highway department might look like. He's offered to consult with the town to help them develop a notice of intent if the town's interested. And he shared with us some sample notices of intent that other towns have developed. And he is saying that if the town wants to proceed with that, he can assist so that the town would not need to hire a consultant to do the development. Because it's, you don't really need to reinvent the wheel. You just need to tweak the format of existing notices of intent used by other towns. So my suggestion had been that perhaps we put this on our agenda for our meeting in next meeting in June, and invite Mark Stinson and invite the highway department to come and just have the preliminary discussion about what that might look like.
Sounds great.
Sound
Yeah.
good, everybody? Okay.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
And that'll be the same night that we will be meeting with the library building committee. So we got a notice from the highway department that they are going to be installing a beaver flow protection device over at that upper pond culvert from Montague Road with Beaver Solutions. And so I'll be probably putting together the paperwork for that in the next week. And one of my questions for the commission about that was, do we want to add any conditions requiring that they develop a maintenance plan for that device? Because we did get a request from the abutter that if there was a flow protection device, that it include a maintenance plan, as she has done with the flow protection device that she has installed at the downstream dam.
So this is where the beaver dam is. Are they gonna take the beaver dam out?
No, they would let the beavers do what the beavers want to do, and they would just have a flow protection pipe going through it.
Oh, okay.
So that would keep the impoundment from building up, and the beavers can do whatever it is they want to do.
I think they need a maintenance plan since that's been the issue with this buildup.
Okay.
Yeah, that sounds like a good idea.
Yeah.
Okay. We also got a couple of emails that I forwarded to the commission from the abutter, from Lois Brown. She's in the process of completing an engineering study about the how to remove the dam, the stone and concrete dam on her property. And there was some back and forth email communication between her and Becky Torres, and the landowner is asking the town to get an engineering assessment to assess the structural integrity of the downstream culvert to ensure that it is capable of handling the increased flow if they remove the dam. And that was on the recommendation of their engineer. So that is in the works, hopefully. Okay, site visits. We went to 678 Pratt Corner Road and looked at the property where there is a restoration under an enforcement order. You guys want to share your observations?
Yeah, I thought it all looked good, all the shrubs and the ground cover that they planted. I guess there were some ferns that you had noted that might not have done so well, but everything else seemed to be doing really well. It certainly created a wet area, so the hydrology has worked out really great there at that wetland. It was really wet. So yeah, no, I thought it all looked good. I think it has good potential to definitely be a wetland.
Yes, lots of water. It's a super wet spot.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was. I agree with everything Beth said.
The only thing I would add is that on the side of the property, where they had some straw down, the grass that they seeded hasn't taken, and
That's right.
there had been some erosion problems from that slope eroding into another BVW that's just downhill of that area. And so right now it's all okay because there's an erosion control up, but as a long-term solution, I sort of suggest that they reseed it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he seemed, agreeable to that.
So what I'll do, if I have your permission, is I'll write up a letter giving him the feedback. Is that okay?
Yeah.
That's good.
Okay, terrific. We have a site visit scheduled for June 21st for the Camelbrook Bridge. And I just realized that I have to be in Boston that day and I cannot make that that site visit. Do you guys want to do it without me? Do you want to reschedule it for a different day? Who is
What day
going
of the
to,
week is that?
I can't do that day.
I'm sorry, what, Robin?
What day of the week is that? I don't have.
It's a Wednesday.
Okay.
So Mary, you can't do
Yeah.
it?
Yeah, I
Maybe
can't
we
do
should
it.
maybe we should reschedule.
Okay.
Yeah.
We come up with a time now while we're all here.
Sure.
Look at my appointment. Would help if I looked at my calendar before I do these things.
I know.
Sometimes it seems like things appear on my calendar. So the hearing is on Thursday, the 22nd. And so we're meeting twice that week. It just is a reminder, we have the public hearing on Wednesday night at 7 PM for the bylaw regulations. And then on Thursday night at 6 o'clock, we have a regularly scheduled meeting, and that's when we have the public hearing for this particular notice of intent. So we have to do this before the 22nd.
Right.
And Mary, you're away next week, right?
Yes,
When do you come back?
not until the 18th.
Oh. I don't see anything on the 19th. Would that be a possibility? I know sometimes Tuesdays don't seem to work for people.
I think that 19th is actually a holiday.
It is a holiday, yeah.
Oh, that's
Yeah,
right.
I'm not, I can't do 17th, 18th, 19th, or 20th.
Okay. You guys want to do it next week without Mary? I don't know. You want to do this? Could we do a weekend? The 18th, Sunday, the 18th?
It's Father's Day.
Oh,
No.
nope, can't do that.
Nope.
Saturday, the 17th?
I can't.
Okay. All right. Got to do it.
For me, it's either the 2 Wednesdays, either the 14th or back to doing it on the 21st.
Okay. Well, I can do the 14th. So I'd like to suggest we do that if it,
Okay.
and what time works for you guys?
3:45 is fine. That was what it was originally scheduled at 3:45.
Okay, works for me.
Yeah.
3:45 PM. All right, and I will send everybody out the instructions.
Okay.
All right, thanks. Okay, so moving on. Hi, Patrick.
Good evening.
Welcome.
Thank you.
And I don't know if I think everybody has been at a meeting with Patrick before, but maybe if commissioners, if you could just like introduce yourselves.
And Beth Wilson.
Hi, Beth.
Mary
Robin
David.
Harrington.
Good to see you.
Hi, Patrick. My name is Scott Kahn. Very nice to meet you.
And good to see you, Scott.
So I just I thought a little bit about how to structure the meeting tonight. With the understanding being that probably a lot of this discussion tonight will just be amongst the commission and our consultants, including Patrick and Janice Stone and I don't know if Don Wakaluk. I don't know if we're going to want to include public comments tonight. I guess we can see how that goes, whether we like we can fit that in with time. There will be an opportunity for public comment on the hearing of the 21st. But for tonight, what I wanted to do was do a little quick overview for everybody about what we're doing and where we're at with it. And then I was going to ask Patrick to maybe share a little bit of insight into why and how these regulations and regulations in general are important for protecting resource areas. And then we can talk about the draft itself, and we can see what questions commissioners have or what things we might want to review. Does that sound all right?
Yeah.
Yep.
So what I want to do, because I put together a little PowerPoint, I thought it would be easier to see this visually. So give me 1 sec to pony it up. Right, and now everything is Oh, I'm having trouble doing that. Okay, I'm not gonna do this on slideshow because and I'm not gonna be able to see everybody very easily. Can people see the PowerPoint?
Not yet.
Not
No.
yet.
Oh, there.
Now we can.
Yep.
Okay. All right, so this is just a few slides because I thought it would be helpful for just to kind of make sure we're kind of processing it all. So just as an overview, we have bylaws, and Patrick can comment on this a little further, that are allowed to be more restrictive or more protective than the state law under home rule laws. Bylaws, as we've discussed, and I think people understand, are independent of the Wetlands Protection Act and Mass DEP's oversight. They can protect areas that are not protected by the Wetlands Protection Act. Our particular bylaw was passed in 1987 by annual town meeting, and then the regulations were passed in 1990 and then revised in 2000. And the original bylaw was authored by our very own Janice Stone, who's here tonight. And we issue permits under both the Wetlands Protection Act and the bylaw. So I think one of the things that's sort of important in my thinking about this is understanding that we're thinking about regulations that are appropriate for our community, that suit our needs and the unique characteristics of our community. We see permits under the bylaw involving building permit applications, RDAs, notices of intent, emergency certifications, and various kinds of enforcement reviews. The kinds of projects that we review include new construction, accessory structures, septic systems, driveway paving, tree removals. Those are just some examples. And we will review a lot of municipal projects, including the highway department, the annual Lake Wyola drawdown, beaver management, various kinds of infrastructure repair and maintenance, the new construction for the library, for example, the Sawmill River culvert replacement, which is a big project, and various kinds of emergency certifications that come up throughout the year. Because we have a great pond in Shutesbury that's also a residential and recreational lake, we see a lot of projects around Lake Wyola. About 30% of all the things we review are specific to the Lake Wyola district or riverfront area, such as the Sawmill River. We have several perennial streams in Shutesbury. And in particular, in those areas, we look at construction projects, septic system upgrades, tree removals. In fiscal year 22, for example, to give a sense of why we do what we do, about 94% of the site visits that we conducted involved properties where there were at least some jurisdictional wetland resource area on the property. Shutesbury is a community with a lot of wetland resource areas. We also have a lot of hills and unpaved roads. We have 16 plus miles of unpaved roads, which comprise 43% of all the roads in Shutesbury. I saw a report recently said we spend about over $100,000 a year on maintenance, and the unpaved roads result in ongoing issues around erosion management and stormwater management, particularly near wetlands, which come under our review. So what is the difference between bylaws versus regulations? And again, Patrick can talk about this, but bylaws are passed by town meeting, whereas regulations are promulgated by the Conservation Commission. Regulations define, explain the standards and procedures by which the bylaw is applied and flesh out what's really basically the minimal language in the bylaw. It also includes the fee schedules associated with various permit activities, and communities revise regulations to keep up with evolving standards and needs. And again, Patrick can maybe explain this a little further and better than I can, but trainings that I've gone to at MACC have talked a lot about new case law that have basically said that communities that don't spell out and define their bylaw jurisdiction may not be able to exercise it. It may not hold up upon review. So it's kind of a use it or lose it concept, that if we don't have regulations, my understanding is the bylaw jurisdiction may not be enforceable. So areas for update that we were looking at, we looked at the 100-foot buffer zone, which is a protected resource under the bylaw, and evolving science is highlighting the buffer zone as a bioactive zone, which is critically important, not just sort of the border to something that's important. It's important in its own right, and it's critical for climate resilience. Vernal pools and isolated wetlands, subsurface streams, which is a resource area under our bylaw that we identified as needing to be defined. Our current regulations do not have much in the way of performance standards. We also were looking to define how mitigation and restoration standards would be approached, to better define exemptions and waivers, and provide an expedited review for minor projects, and update fees to reflect the current reality. We have been observing for a long time that there are a lot of permit activities that we currently have no fees for whatsoever, whereas many communities are levying fees in order to offset some of the administrative costs for reviewing those permit activities. So just to summarize kind of the process to date, in 2020 to 2021, the Conservation Commission, and this is even before I joined it, and I think everybody else on the commission, well, I think Robin was on the commission at that time, started a working group to look at either updating the bylaw or the regulations. And in early 2021, we had a meeting where we discussed the need to update the regulations first. Then in the public hearings for the solar ANRADs in 2022, there was discussion about subsurface streams and the fact that our bylaw regulations didn't define this resource area, and yet it is identified in the bylaw itself. So we were advised by town council to develop new regulations. At that point, we hired Patrick, and we started the process of developing a new draft regulation, which has now been released for public comment and public review, and it's on our website. And our plan is to have a public hearing on June 21st. In the meantime, the public is welcome to email us with comments or to come to the public hearing, and we are looking for public comment as well as comment from town boards. So how did we what resources and what was the process for developing these draft regulations? We looked at the regulations from other communities that have done updated regulations in the last 5 years. And here are just the names of some of the ones we looked at, as well as guidance from MACC. And then after kind of assembling a rough draft, it went through several reviews with me and Beth, Janice, Don, and Patrick. And I've sent the draft to Donna McNichol for a review to get some feedback from her. So one of the questions people might be asking is, why is the document so long? Perhaps one reason is just because I was involved and I don't do anything in a limited way. Go big or go home. Anyway, the idea is to capture enough information so that these regulations can serve as a roadmap for future projects and for future commissions to rely upon. So it articulates scientific standards and policies for a whole wide array of situations so that the public and applicants can have a clear understanding of how the bylaw will be applied by the commission, and so that the commission can refer back to those regulations for guidance on how to apply the bylaw, thereby hopefully creating some consistency and uniformity in the way that we approach reviews and making it transparent to the public why we're doing it, that we're basing it on some scientific standards.
Mhm.
And it includes a number of policies and standards for things like stormwater management, how we're going to approach rare species habitat protection, protection of the buffer zone, things of that ilk. Just some highlights of what is in these drafts. We included and adopted, we're suggesting including and adopting several of the exemptions for minor activities that are included in the Wetlands Protection Act, but not all of them. And I'll talk about that in a second. We have a provision in the exemptions for highway department road maintenance as an exempt activity, which should make things easier for the highway department. For municipal projects, we have a number of reasons why we might waive some provisions and standards. And one of them is if a project is a broad public importance and value, so that municipal projects might get some priority treatment because they're addressing public needs. We have protection standards for both the buffer zone and also for vernal pools that are more clearly defined. And we're suggesting establishing a 50-foot no disturb zone within the buffer zone, which may be waived in circumstances where there's a property perhaps that is so small that there's no practicable alternative outside of the 50-foot zone, but we would have some requirements and standards for mitigation. We've got definitions and performance standards for defining subsurface streams and a number of policies, including no net change in runoff, defining stormwater management, alternative mitigation, including something that Amherst has begun using, which is an alternative mitigation fund, where if an applicant is unable to mitigate an impact on their property or on a property that's under their control, they could pay into a fund that would allow for some wetlands protection elsewhere in the community under the jurisdiction of the Conservation Commission. And we have updated fees. One of the things that we talked about, since we were thinking about not adopting the minor exemption under the Wetlands Protection Act for accessory structures within the 100-foot buffer zone. We review a lot of projects that fall in this category. And many properties in Shutesbury have buffer zones near houses where people are proposing projects. So we wanted to create a pathway that would be streamlined and more fair and reasonable for applicants to do projects in the buffer zone near their residential homes that wouldn't have the heavy lift of doing an RDA. So we're proposing creating a small project permit, which a lot of communities are adopting. I've looked at probably a dozen or more conservation commissions that have included things like this in their regulations. And basically in this kind of, and they call them different things, but basically the idea would be that this permit would not require any professional delineation or engineered plans. The applicant would not need to submit a legal notice, which is very expensive these days to put an ad in the newspaper, or a butter notifications, which can also be very costly with the cost of mailings. There'd be a brief permit, a site visit, and then the approval would be given at a scheduled meeting, as not a public hearing. And there might be a minimal fee involved. And this would allow small projects to get permitted quickly, both saving the applicant and the Conservation Commission time while still allowing us to have some oversight and review because it's happening within the buffer zone. So trying to kind of thread that needle and find the right balance between making things fair and reasonable for the applicant, as well as ensuring that we have some knowledge of what's going on and some opportunity to have some input into conditions. And just kind of, again, to sort of summarize what I've just said, that, you know, the hope is that these regulations will create some consistency and predictability. and some reasonable options for both waivers and mitigation. That the fees will be more more fair and reasonable. And that we'll have a decision tree embedded in these regulations that will be based upon up-to-date scientific standards. And I guess my thought about it is that in understanding why it's important to have these regulations, it's not just kind of what we're doing now in Shutesbury and what life in Shutesbury looks like, but also preparing for the future, because things are going to change with evolving environmental pressures and climate change, as well as perhaps future development pressures. When the town was going through the municipal vulnerability planning process, there was discussion about whether in the future with climate change, there may be increased development pressures in Shutesbury as people retreat from areas that are no longer habitable in the next 50 years along the coastline, that inland areas may experience different kinds of development pressures. And Shutesbury doesn't have a lot of commercial development or large housing development, but we may in the future have bigger, more complex projects. And so having robust regulations will give us the tools we need when those projects come forward. So just to kind of frame some questions I thought might be useful for our discussion is kind of, why do we need these regulations? What are their benefits? What are our needs now and in the future? What's the environmental significance of protecting the aura, the adjacent upland resource area, or buffer zone is known as, and how do we want to best regulate it? Okay, so that is just my thoughts about it. And I'd like to kind of invite Patrick perhaps to comment on some of those questions if you can. Maybe give us your 2 cents.
Okay, I will attempt to. And feel free to stop me and ask questions as I go along. I think all of you know I've sort of been in the wetland environmental field in Massachusetts for probably over 30 years. Quick background, I was president of MACC on 2 different terms. I was president of the Association of Massachusetts Wetland Scientists. I've been on 5 DEP technical advisory committees, including the riverfront and the stormwater regs and that kind of thing by invitation from DEP. Predominantly right now, I do almost all of my work as a peer reviewer for multiple commissions around the state. And I work as an expert witness, particularly specializing in adjudicatory cases on wetland appeals. So in terms of bylaws and regulations and that sort of thing, I've worked in maybe a half a dozen towns, both helping to craft the regulations and reviewing them and that sort of thing. So I've seen them both in very urbanized areas. For instance, I worked with the city of Framingham on their regulations, and I worked in a little tiny town. I don't know if any of you are familiar with it, in central Massachusetts, the town of Berlin, which is in many ways a lot like Shutesbury. It's got a lot of open space and a lot of protected areas and a lot of resources. So I've sort of seen a wide scope of these things. I've worked on the draft regulations at Miriam's request and made a number of comments and read through it. And yes, I agree, it's incredibly long. I think, as I said to Miriam, I'd love to see it cut by 30%, but that's not a suggestion. That's just a wish to make it more palatable for the public to cut through. But it's very thorough, and as such, I think it's good, and it would be very difficult to cut it maybe more than about 10%. But that's not really where I'm heading with this. In overall scope from the various regulations that I both worked with and reviewed and helped write, this is a good set of regulations. And of course, this is an update to the existing regulations, and the reason that commissions typically do this. And is because the science changes and the regulations themselves change, and DEP is actively making changes to case law through its SOCs and adjudicatory decisions. And all of that sort of influences the relevance of existing regulations. So a good commission may change its or modify its regulations every decade or so. Rarely faster than that, but that may be a good average. And as a perspective, I think the current figure is about 55 to 60% of towns have bylaws and regulations. And as Miriam said, the regulations are key, as you guys know. The bylaws are not really considered relevant by courts unless there's an underlying regulation that define how those bylaws are to be interpreted. So, it's a necessity. The key, of course, is that the regulations be able to be interpreted, both by people in the environmental field, but by the public as well. And my experience has always been that for these to be successful in the long term, they have to be sort of user friendly. The public has got to feel like they're a reasonable document that has been created to protect resources, and they can sort of understand what those resources are and what the purpose behind them is. And that's all there in the regulations. So, you can't please everybody all the time, but as a general outreach, I think, that needs to always be on the commission's mind. I've seen a number of these go down in different towns when the public begins to feel alienated. And I think a careful read of the draft regulations as they are now is a sort of a positive thing. That was at least my reaction, having seen an awful lot of these. And I do want to mention one thing, Miriam, to the municipal projects exemption that you mentioned. You can do so under the bylaw, but I do want to emphasize that you can't exempt municipal projects under the standard Wetland Protection Act regs. I remember vividly working with the city of Billerica. We spent about 18 months trying to create a generic order of conditions for municipal projects under the Wetland Protection Act. We finished it, got it completed, got it approved, and DEP stepped in and said, you can't do that. Every project is unique. So, you can do so in your bylaw. You can exempt anything you want, but don't forget that municipal projects.
When you're saying a generic permit, Patrick, are you talking like a bundled notice of intent kind of thing for?
Yeah, it was essentially saying that, almost all the municipal projects, particularly DPW projects, are similar. They're doing road repaving, they're fixing bridges, they're putting in guardrails, and that the commission would have already sort of created a boilerplate order of conditions that would address each of those. And under the Wetland Protection Act, DEP stepped in and said, you can't do that. Each project has to be considered unique, and you have to assess, the potential impacts to each project as it's proposed. So I'm just throwing that out as a reminder that, you can waive those under the bylaw, but you can't under the state reg. And I think your overview is a great overview. And you only touch 75 topics there. So I think, rather than trying to cover each one, probably be better at this point for me to bounce it back to you guys and, open up a dialogue and a discussion.
Thanks. I have some questions for you, but maybe I'd like to see what kind of questions the commissioners have first.
Okay. I do want to mention one thing that I can emphasize from a tremendous amount of experience, and that is that the what you're calling the AURA, the adjacent upland resource area, which is typically called the buffer zone, everywhere, and you're sort of calling it the same thing at the same time, is a really important part of the regulations. And I'm going to say why I think that, and this is going to be from a sort of a scientific point of view, but the Wetland Protection Act, as it exists, was a really groundbreaking environmental document. And when the regulations were first issued, within the environmental world in the United States, Massachusetts was sort of the envy of almost every state, particularly in the North. And that has changed, though, because it's become very stagnant. It hasn't really, with the exception of the stormwater regs and the riverfront protection regulations that came in later, the Wetland Protection Act has not really changed much, whereas the science has evolved quite rapidly. So the driving purpose behind towns having bylaws and regulations is that they are an enhanced protection. And what we found repeatedly, and I see this constantly in appeals and adjudicatory work, is that a huge amount of appeals revolve around work within the buffer zone. And I will see large scale projects come in where a developer will propose 2- and 3-story buildings 10 feet from the edge of BVW. They're not impacting resource areas directly. There may be no loss of BVW, but there'll be significant work within feet of the actual BVW edge itself. DEP under appeal will almost without exception approve those, even if a commission has denied them. And what we see scientifically, and DEP doesn't want to deal with this because it's very expensive every year, almost without exception. Their budgets are cut back, their legal staff is reduced, and so they want to move things along as easily as they can. But on a scientific level, the impacts to buffer zone, particularly the closer you get to the resource area, does alter and change the resource itself. And it does so by a change in shade and sun. That creates temperature changes. And the changes, because I've monitored many sites for over a decade where we've seen this sort of thing occur, are not abrupt, but they're gradual. And what will happen is, because a wetland regime will go from being 50% shaded to being completely under sun, or it'll be the opposite, where it was a meadow and suddenly a building is there and it creates tremendous shade. And over a period of years, the vegetation will completely change. And it may go from one typical regime to another. It may thin out, it may become denser, but alterations occur. Wildlife habitat changes occur, hydrology changes occur. So all of these things physically take place, and it's well documented. The MACC has got extensive literature that it's documented about this, and as does the Corps of Engineers and EPA. And so I'm not saying anything particularly unique, but DEP has ceased to become a reliable enforcer. They work strictly off the Wetland Protection Act regulations, and the regulations say basically that buffer zones are a zone in which any project that is proposed to be within that 100 feet triggers a permit requirement. But what the developer does within that zone is allowed, as long as it doesn't directly and instantly impact the resource area that adjoins the project. So that's really why bylaws have begun to just be rolled out in town after town after town, because towns have sort of seen this happening. And so I think the concept of the aura is really excellent. And you guys need to decide internally whether you think it is too harsh, that the requirements are too severe, or whether you think it's flexible enough that it's a workable concept. But as a protected area, it's something I'm just tremendously enthusiastic about, and was pleased to see it built into the regulations.
Patrick, can you say anything about wildlife habitat and wildlife needs in the aura? Because
Well,
that's something
yeah.
that we commented on. That in some ways the aura 100 feet is kind of a very common limit, but in fact, many species require more than 100 feet.
Yeah, it's a site by site sort of thing, and I think you guys know that, you know, every site is unique. It's a bit like a vernal pool, where under the Wetland Protection Act, vernal pools are protected within 100 feet, although their protection stops at the edge of BVW. So it's a little confusing, but vernal pool species per se will typically, and I'm thinking of both wood frogs and the various species of salamanders, will use the upland area adjoining the vernal pool at distances of 800 to 1,200 feet. And that's well documented as well, but we protect 100 feet of it. So I've seen many vernal pools, particularly in central Mass, that have a full 100-foot protection around them. Everybody's done their best to provide maximum protection, and buildings and roads and drainage are built, you know, right up to that 100-foot edge. And within a few years, it becomes a dead zone because we've eliminated the upland habitat. So the 100 feet on a site-by-site basis, you know, you could certainly find a particular site that was, you could argue the 100 feet was insufficient, but there would be other sites where previous alterations that occurred in the upland that might have very minimal habitat value. So it's sort of a site-by-site assessment. But what they do on a sort of yearly basis, regardless of season, is they act as a corridor that allows species to move fluidly from location to location. And so they serve sort of a long-term permanent basis to protect wildlife, far more than if something was built right up to the edge of the resource itself. And I know under the bylaw you're calling the aura a resource area, but when I say resource, I'm referring to the classic wetland protection resource areas.
I see a bunch of hands raised, so I don't know whose hands were raised first. Scott, were you, or Mary? Which one of you first? I don't
So
know.
mine's kind of a general question, so, you know,
Go ahead, Mary.
so that my obviously this is very long and detailed. Can you identify which areas are there areas in particular that we should pay more attention to or have more discussion about as a recommendation?
And you're asking me.
Yes.
My personal experience is that streams and riparian areas are more sensitive and should be more carefully regulated than say a BVW area. And I say that because under the Wetland Protection Act, BVW is BVW. I mean, it doesn't, there's no value criteria. We don't rank BVW from 0 to 10 and say this is a 7 and this one over here is a 2. But in reality, we know that there are incredibly robust areas of bordering vegetated wetlands, and there are other areas that are very minimal in terms of their habitat value and their ability to sort of address the other interests of the act. But invariably riparian areas with small streams, intermittent streams, perennial streams, lakes, ponds, seeps on hillsides, which you guys, I think, have a fair amount. All of those are very sensitive and you get my vote for that over something else.
Okay, thank you. Scott?
Great. Thanks, Miriam. Hey, Patrick, thank you very much for that. And actually, do you know where Berlin is? I grew up in the little town of Bolton, right next to it. And the folks who work on the commission there in Berlin. But my question for you is, I really appreciate your description of the importance of the upland areas and what what these bylaws could do in terms of protecting, the buffer zone. And my question is, these different zones that we've looked at, whether it's 50 feet or 100 feet, I wonder if you have thoughts on that in terms of, all the work that you've done on the technical committees that you've been a part of in terms of what is that. Obviously more is better, but there's a diminishing rate of return depending on, what we're trying to accomplish. And I'm wondering if you have some thoughts on how far that buffer is really most important to protecting wetland function. And then the second part of my question really is around the minor exempt activity piece that I appreciate Miriam raising that too. I'm curious about, for the minor exempt activities that were defined under the State Wetland Protection Act, if you've had a chance to look, when you looked at what we were proposing to carry over to the bylaw versus the ones that we weren't, in terms of which of those activities, are there some that are just so potentially impactful that we wouldn't want to exempt them in a buffer area, even though they may be exempt under the State Wetland Protection Act? Thank you.
Nothing complex about that question. Yeah, I know Bolton well. I drove through it yesterday. Lovely town. And I was in Boylston this morning, right next to Bolton. Yeah, we're all seeking simple answers, but I think there's not one to your initial question about how far out should a zone go. And the reason, of course, is that the resource that we're trying to protect varies in its value, right? I mean, there are really robust and valuable resources, and we've all seen that. We've gone out on the site and gone, oh my gosh, this is crazy. We've got to do everything we can to protect this. And there are other resources that may have been altered 50 years ago or 100 years ago, or that just don't, because of their geology or other factors, not have that sort of robust value that we instantly recognize or can assess and recognize through other measures. So it's really, I'm just a huge proponent of a site-by-site assessment. And that's why I think I said 10 minutes ago that I'm an advocate of some flexibility that allows the commission, when it goes out on a particular site, to have that flexibility. They have that in their toolbox so they can sort of do a case-by-case evaluation, essentially, of how important a particular area is and how extensive that buffer zone should be. I will tell you that there are an awful lot of towns that have adopted under their bylaw and their regulations. What's most typical probably is a 25-foot no build and a 50-foot sort of minimal disturbance zone. And that sort of takes care of that earlier issue I was talking about with buildings going up right along the edge of wetlands, and it sets it back far enough that it creates a wildlife corridor. It takes care of shading issues, and it takes care of a large percent of hydrology issues, because you dig a foundation and maybe you're going to dig a hole 10 feet down, but the hydrology, the seasonal high groundwater may be 3.5 feet below natural grade. And you dig a hole there, and it may be a large hole that's 60, 80, 100, 120 feet long. you're going to alter the flow of that groundwater that normally would have seeped into the wetland. And you're going to have this sort of difficult to measure, but realistic alterations that's going to occur there. So that's sort of the purpose behind the minimum thresholds, the minimum protection zones. And it creates a sort of easily used instrument for the commission, so that every site doesn't become a tremendous head scratcher, right? You know that there are minimum protection zones, and that's good. But in terms of, should the 100 feet be a black and white 100 feet? I don't think so. But I think the fact that that you've got that option built into the regs, the proposed regs, is marvelous, because when you do hit those unusual sites, or the sites that everybody recognizes need maximum protection, you've got that ability to implement that.
I think if I could just interject for a second, Patrick, to follow up on this, and maybe Janice and Beth, you can chime in, but we did have a lot of back and forth discussion about whether we wanted to have it like a 25-foot no build or a 50-foot. And I think what we ended up deciding was that, because Shutesbury, most properties are built on larger sites than, for example, Amherst, where, you've got a lot of buildings that are on like a quarter of an acre, whereas, almost the majority of the non-Lake Wyola district properties are at least an acre, and sometimes multiple acres, which gives people a little bit of more room to move away from the wetland boundaries. So we thought about creating this 50-foot no build zone, with an understanding that if an applicant presented an alternatives analysis to us and said there's no practicable alternative for them to build this garage or do a driveway or whatever it is they're doing, or put in this shed, except for within that 50 feet, that would, that there would be opportunities for mitigation and waivers based on that. That was, am I right? Is that kind of
I think that was fair, and I recognize that the regulations appear to have sort of a backdoor allowing that kind of analysis, which is really essential too, so that you're not in court all the time. That's something to
Carrie,
avoid.
somebody in the waiting room, my computer has frozen, so I can't let them in. Thanks. Is that, Janice and Beth, is that kind of capturing our thought discussion about that?
Yeah, I think so.
It also just felt, I think we had this discussion that if we had this 25-foot no build and the 50-foot minimal disturbance, that it might end up defaulting to everybody sort of assuming that there's really just a 25-foot limit. So by saying that's 50 feet no build, we're kind of establishing a baseline from which we might vary based on the necessity of the situation with the applicant.
Right.
Scott, you had your hand raised?
Yeah, and that was helpful, Patrick. And I guess the second part to my question, I was wondering if you could touch on that with the minor exempt activities vary quite a bit in terms of their potential impact on wetlands. I'm wondering if you, in looking at that here with the proposed bylaw revisions that allow for some of those, but not for all of them, if you had some thoughts, or if you could speak to, the relative impacts of the ones we're proposing to allow versus the ones that we're less comfortable with in terms of their impact on wetland habitats.
Yeah, I realized when I addressed your question that I didn't address your questions. So I was going to come back to the exemption thing. I don't know how many of you have read the Wetland Protection Act, but it's riddled with exceptions. It says thou shalt not accept, and then the accepts go on and on and on, and it genuinely gives you a headache. I think in the Shutesbury regulations, for the most part, I had no problem with what I was reading, and I liked for the most part. I will throw out one warning, Miriam. I was rereading the regs just before this meeting, and there's one, I think under the exemption section, there was one reference to agriculture, particularly, and it used the word improvements to agriculture. I would flag that and sort of throw out a caution that you may want to try to define that a little bit more. And I say that because I've worked on an awful lot of appeals to agriculture, and the Wetland Protection Act itself has a whole different set of criteria, as some of you may know, for agriculture. The buffer zones are different. The improvements, quote unquote, are different. And one farmer's improvement is another farmer's, massive expansion. And so we don't define the word improvement in these regs, and that sort of threw out a red light to me. And I think about that right now because I'm working on a huge case on the South Shore with cranberries, and there's a large commercial company down there that is trying to claim that they're increasing existing cranberry bogs by about 50 acres of new cranberry bogs, and they're stating that it's simply an improvement under the regulations. And of course, the opponents have appealed this. It's gone through the DEP process on a superseding level, and DEP approved it. And what the 50 acres is, or where the 50 acres is occurring, is in completely unaltered natural pine lands that haven't been touched in probably 10,000 years. And we've gotten testimony from experts who deal with agricultural improvements, and they've testified that under the Wetland Protection Act, the intent of that was that it be straightening crooked areas, cleaning up drainage canals, doing things that are sort of more maintenance related than expansionary. But the regulations under the Wetland Protection Act are also so vague that it's created this colossal argument that's now in court. So, you may want to take a quick look at improvements to agriculture.
Okay.
But that being said, Scott, I thought that what I was reading with that exception was reasonable. Again, it gave the commission flexibility, and it gave applicants the ability to sort of argue that there are other alternatives or no alternatives. And I largely liked what I saw.
Thank you.
Did that answer your question, Scott, or?
Yeah, I was just thinking about that. I guess I was, originally some of the things we've struggled with here are having the bylaw and the exemptions under the State Wetland Protection Act. As you said, there are a number of them, and they're enumerated there, that we've thought, well, are there really such a thing as a minor exempt activity if the bylaw itself extinguishes all of them? It doesn't allow for any minor exempt activities. And I think we're trying to balance that against, still providing for the wetland protections that we're all, concerned with. And so what are truly minor and what are maybe not so minor that we need to spend time from the commission looking at and weighing that.
Wait, I'm seeing somebody in the waiting room. My screen is frozen, so I can't let them in. I think. Go ahead.
And
Sorry.
we're trying to weigh that out. And so what I'm hearing you say is, for the ones that we're allowing or proposing to allow, this is all just conversation, but that those truly may be of less concern or less potential impact to wetland habitats. And for the ones that we're not choosing to allow, I think about the conversion of like lawn to building is one I believe that we aren't proposing to allow, that those might be ones that we would, that may have greater impacts on wetland habitats, and that's kind of your look at it. So I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that's what I was hearing you, interpreting you to say, but I want to make sure that I'm right.
Yeah, and I'm a little hesitant to drill down too deeply here because, you know, as I keep saying, every project is unique. But yeah, usually the conversion of something like lawn to a building expansion where you're creating impervious area is a bit of a trigger because you're changing the stormwater, you're changing the direction of the stormwater and where it's going, and all of those are potential impacts. There was something else I wanted to kick in here, and it's escaping me, but
Well, when you remember,
I know I was going to address the
Okay.
small project provision in the regulations. And I think, you know, I mentioned 20-30 minutes ago that there's always a public wrestling match that takes place between the, you know, the perception of the public and the commission's need to protect resources. And something like the small project provision that's built in is really rather cool, because I think it directly addresses that concern, and it says, hey, look, you know, we don't want to hassle you guys, you know, and we get it that you got property and you want to be able to do stuff like, you know, whatever it may be, all the minor things that we all do to our properties. But you know, so it sort of creates an easy path for that sort of minor thing, while allowing the commission to capture things that might actually have an impact that maybe the homeowner doesn't recognize.
Yeah.
But there's a funny thing, and I often say this before commissions, but because I do so many peer reviews, I have the privilege of sitting in commission hearings, and usually I'll be doing a moderate to large scale project. That's usually what I'm pulled in to review. And for instance, the commission may say, okay, your hearing is going to be at 8 o'clock. And at 7:30, there will be a hearing on a deck expansion behind someone's house. And the commission will go on and on and on. 45 minutes, an hour will go by as they discuss, you know, adding 200 square feet to this back deck. And finally, you know, it'll be finished, and then we'll go to this huge project that's developing 60 parking spaces and, you know, tripling the size of the detention basin, and the commission will approve it 20 minutes later. It's like, you know, and so I see this regularly. And so whenever I see a commission sort of recognizing that these small common projects that you tend to see the most of are something that should be sort of tilted toward the public's, in the public's favor, as long as it's clearly doesn't create an impact, I'm always enthusiastic.
very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. My screen is now no longer visible, so I'm going to log in on my phone, but if somebody got their hand raised, would somebody let me know for a sec?
Don has.
Done.
hand up.
Don, go ahead.
Just a quick question. I'm Patrick. I'm the town's tree warden, and I've been asked several times about the large projects that go into town involve clear cutting. We're, as a town, subject to the Forest Cutting Act. We can't tell people with private property that they can't log their property. But when they convert their properties by clear cutting, and clearly wetlands are affected, how confident are you that we can quantify repeatable results measuring the impact on underground water sources, discharge rates, drinking water supplies. I'm concerned that we as a town have no say in controlling our drinking water supplies.
Yeah, that's a difficult one, and I'm not confident that you can. I mean, to be honest with you, that it's always a wrestling match. We typically assess that sort of an impact through using the stormwater regulations, within the Wetland Protection Act, and that's a matter of assessing the pre and post development runoff, and even those regulations are very soft. They're very weak because what they do is they measure peak runoff for a series of storm events, but they don't measure the change in volume. So, for instance, addressing trees, you may have 150 trees cut on a site, or 250 or 600, and those trees have tremendous uptake, right? They have evapotranspiration, and they play a key role in balancing groundwater and runoff from the site. And the stormwater regulations only take a look at surface runoff and the impacts, and the impacts are typically mitigated through infiltration or some sort of basin. So, I mean, trees are a whole different world. I mean, you know far better than I do probably, but that trees serve multiple purposes. And shading habitats for multiple species. And it's very difficult to mitigate that because in many cases, the trees that are going to be cut down are ancient or decades and decades old. And, I've seen a lot of projects that are going to cut hundreds of trees. I think most recently, about 4 years ago, I was peer reviewing a 40B project in the town of Weston, and that's a town where money is endless, and there's lots of opportunity to fight experts endlessly. And the site was going to cut down close to 600 mature trees, and they were going to mitigate it by landscaping it with new trees that were going to be 4 to 6 feet, whips basically, that were going to be planted as substitutes. And that project got into all of the issues that you raised: water quality, hydrology, groundwater effects, and it's still on appeal, years later, over basically those many issues. They ended up having on that site, putting in dozens of groundwater monitoring wells, doing constant checking of the key in that case, and in all of these cases really is establishing a baseline so you can measure the existing conditions against future conditions. And in some cases, the commission can sort of control that with a really robust order of conditions that specify certain performance standards that the developer has to meet. But a lot of that is smoke and mirrors. I mean, what do you do once the project is built and it fails to meet certain conditions? Then what do you do? You've got this mega project that's sitting there, and you can't. It's very difficult to claw things back. So your questions are, it's completely legitimate as a question. And I'm not sure I have a great reassuring answer for you.
Thank you.
We
Yeah,
did include in these regulations a process for tree removal permitting and some standards.
yes, and they're good ones, but I'm thinking Don raised the issues of groundwater and drinking water quality and that sort of thing. And
Yeah.
it's difficult. It's very complex. It's it's appropriate for things like large scale solar projects and large industrial and commercial projects. It's not appropriate for homeowner sort of analysis, but a large scale developer has the funding, the resources, and the civil engineering expertise to be able to measure some of these baseline criteria that I'm talking about. And the commission and the town has the ability to hold them to maintaining those pre-existing standards. It's a matter of sort of anticipating and saying, okay, before you cut down the first tree, we want you to assess the following things. And that assessment that has to take place during normal conditions. It can't be during, incredible periods of rain or 3 months of droughts or, and so that's another complexity that gets thrown into the mix. So you can see why I said I was hesitant to drill down too much on your question, but it's a great one. It's just that, on the larger projects, I think one of the things I always recommend to towns is that you bring in someone like me. You want someone closer to your territory than I am, but you'd want someone with that kind of expertise, and have someone like you, Don, say, here's what I want you to tell me how we protect, and let that assessment take place, and then let the commission, the planning board, other 10 agencies condition it to sort of ensure that the greatest likelihood is there that it will be in fact protected. A great state provision is what it's, Miriam and I have talked about this, but it's 53G. It's the state regulation that allows town boards essentially to hire experts at the developer's expense so that it doesn't become a burden on the town. And I have seen large-scale projects where towns have brought in close to a dozen different experts on everything from groundwater to traffic to wetlands, and they can go on and on and on. Aesthetics, and so if the project warrants it, the developer under state law is bound to comply with that level of analysis at their expense and not at the town's.
Patrick, one of the things that I think we're thinking about in terms of these regulations is making sure that we have all the tools at our disposal for evaluating cumulative impacts. And again, we're not talking about somebody putting a shed up on their property. We're talking about maybe large projects or multiple large commercial projects, where we're talking about watershed level impacts. What do you think is important? Do you think that these regulations give us those tools? Do we need these regulations in order to assess cumulative impacts?
Yeah, I think the regulations are thorough enough that it gives you those tools. Again, the key is that the commission be able to sort of assess where you want to go with what you're demanding an analysis of. You got to have that sort of in-house expertise. It's one of the weaknesses, frankly, of the small project provision, because in that proposed provision, you don't require a professional delineation. You don't require 2-scale plans. And so what that does is it shifts the burden to the commission members to have in-house expertise so that you can walk out on a site, look at a wetland edge and say, yeah, this looks reasonable, because most wetlands are fairly, obvious, but there are some subtle instances where wetlands are not really where you think they are. So as long as you've got that in-house expertise, cool. But if the commission changes over and it's, a whole different group of people and they don't know much about wetlands, but they love, they love trees or something, that's the danger to the commission, is that you can't readily identify these things. But I think, I think the regulations are thorough enough and for the most part robust enough that you've got the tools to ask for that information if you want to. And again, that's the key, is it's that site by site evaluation I keep coming back to.
And my understanding from our conversation with town council is that we need to have definitions and regulations so that applicants know in advance and have predictability before the application process. That it's very challenging for us to introduce standards after the fact, after a permit's been introduced, and that we would do that at our peril. So that was really kind of how we were advised, that we needed to make sure that things were transparent to an applicant ahead of time.
Yeah, no, I agree totally. I mean, it's gotta be out there in public and readily accessible so they know what they have to deal with before they come to you. You can't do that after you've seen the project.
Do you want to talk a little bit about subsurface streams? Because that was one of the places where we started with this whole discussion about revising the regulations. And you've given us some definitions and, you know, performance standards around it. Maybe could you walk us through that a little bit?
Sure. The draft regulations as they stand now, as I recall, have a 200-foot limitation. But it's essentially the subsurface stream is where it's flowing along merrily and then it disappears. And then something that you think is the same stream reappears somewhere down gradient. And the question is, should the stream, which ceases to be a stream and becomes some sort of subsurface flow, be protected? And I think the obvious answer scientifically and environmentally is yes, clearly, because typically what's going to happen is that someone's going to come in and want to put a driveway in between the in and out of that stream that disappeared. And when they do so, they're going to dig out the subsoil and they're going to put in all kinds of things, and they could completely disrupt the flow of that stream. And the down gradient portion that reappears at some point may disappear or be completely re-altered and rerouted. And then all the associated wetland vegetation, plants and habitat and this sort of thing that were associated with that down gradient portion could be lost. So the justification for trying to define it and protect it is certainly there. It's an unusual phenomenon. I've seen it in a number of towns, but I think it's more common maybe in Shutesbury, partially because it's so hilly. But what we've said, I think, in the regulations as we last visited this thing was that a stream that disappeared into the ground and reappeared within 200 feet would be protectable, and that the stream could be verified as being the same stream down gradient as it was up gradient by using something like dye testing. And I've done a lot of that. There's published EPA protocol for doing dye testing. You can either do it using colors like red and yellow, or you can add tracers, sort of a radioactive background to the dye that is traceable with instrumentation. It's not terribly expensive. It's something that in most cases can be simply observed by somebody who's done this work in the past and knows what they're looking for. It's usually fairly quick. Streams like this tend to have a fairly high velocity. So I think the need to protect it is there. It's justifiable. I think, you know, we've sort of proposed fairly simple, inexpensive techniques to make sure that the down gradient stream is in fact connected. I mean, it's possible that you can see something that you assume is connected that may in fact be a different source. Groundwater does funny things. And although it's fairly predictable, it's not always. And a stream may go subsurface and then flow off east. And you may find a stream 150 feet downstream that breaks out as a seep and then builds volume, and it may be from a different source. So, you know, it does need to be tested and checked. But I think the regs, at least in their draft form, you know, have a way of measuring that.
I don't know if we put I am not remembering, but it would seem like we would need to have some provision for time of year assessment for that, there would be conditions under which that couldn't be verified.
I don't recall whether we had time of year. I know we talked about it in the past. I mean, if you're dealing with an intermittent stream, that's essential. It's got to be a flowing stream. But if it's flowing, well, we get into the nuances almost immediately. If it's barely flowing, for instance, and it goes subsurface, it may not reappear down gradient. Although in the spring, when there's a higher groundwater and greater flow, it may, in fact, the same stream may reappear. I'm making the number up at 150 feet down gradient. So time of year would come into play. If you'd like me to, I can revisit that section and see how we address that, but I don't recall what the current regs say.
That would be great, I think. Because I'm not absolutely sure that we have that. I know that we have some areas where we have, time of year for wetland delineation in general, but I don't think around subsurface streams. We'll take a look at it.
Okay.
We can circle back later. Are there more questions from the commission or comments? I mean, did you guys get a chance to really look through the draft?
If you did, kudos. It's like 70 pages plus, single space.
Yeah, I didn't get all the
longest.
through
It's not the
them.
longest one. Go ahead, Scott.
I did skim them, and this conversation is really helpful, but I need to spend more time with them.
Okay.
I think I'd say the same thing. I did go over, but now I know some areas to go back and refocus on.
Right.
So it's been helpful for me to look at which areas I really want to go back and review again.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I would say the sensitive areas are the small projects and what they cover. And Scott addressed some of those sort of issues, and then the exemptions. And the wording in the exemptions, and believe me, if the wording is ambiguous, you will find somebody who will grab that ambiguity and run with it to
Right.
your anguish.
Well, one of the things that I have heard from I've talked with some commissioners or some agents from communities that have these kind of small project permits. And one of the hazards is that everybody starts off trying to argue that everything is a small project. So they'll, kind of, you get flooded with people kind of pushing the envelope of what is acceptable, and then having to go through that process of saying, no, we're not going to allow it under this permit. You have to submit an RDA. So there may be some of that. I guess the trade-off is that perhaps people who maybe wouldn't apply for a permit at all and would just go out and do something without our even knowing about it will feel a little bit more comfortable coming forward and applying because we have this permit process. So
my memory is too that the draft regs have a provision to allow a party to come in and talk informally to the commission. I didn't see that when I looked at it again today, but I think that was in there.
there's a working sessions you're talking about?
Yeah, sort of like I'm thinking of doing XYZ in my backyard. What do you guys think? Which approach do I need to take? And that's always very helpful too. You can keep it short and quick. But that avoids a lot of grief and public anger. If you have a feeling that you've got a sort of a working relationship from the beginning with the commission.
Yeah, there's a
always
section for that.
Yeah, I always encourage that.
Can you maybe comment more general? This is kind of zooming out a little bit because we're going to getting down in the weeds a little bit, but maybe talk about, because I think this is kind of important for us and also for the public to think about, how do these kind of regulations help us address and combat climate change? What are some of the climate change impacts that the wetland regulations and bylaw will help us with? Do you have any
Well,
thoughts?
I always look at climate change from the point of view of what impact is it going to have on the protected resources? I mean, that's why you exist, and that's why, that's sort of your driving purpose. So things like the aura in its varying widths become critical. As the climate changes, those areas act as a true buffer, in the scientific and physical sense, protecting those areas. And the more sort of buffering that you can have to these resource areas, the greater the resiliency that's sort of built in. And you don't have that if you do a DEP project that allows development up to 5 feet away from BVW. That there's no margin for any change of any kind. So that plays a key role. And I think, from a helicopter view, that sort of protection is the climate change answer. We really can't anticipate what changes may occur. We've got a lot of different studies that point in different directions, but we know we have things like increased heat, and we have things like more abrupt but stronger storm events, and that sort of thing. We have pretty strong consensus, and I think we're observing a lot of that now. And so again, the sort of natural undeveloped buffer that we can build around these resource areas inevitably protects them. But beyond that, it's a little difficult for me to opine, because I'm like a lot of people. I'm just not sure what our climate change is going to be, say, 50 years from now.
I think one of the other issues that we're debating and kind of trying to grapple with these regulations is, there's kind of a very different set of conditions around Lake Wyola that we look at all the time. There's about 100 plus properties right along the lakeshore of Lake Wyola. It's a residential recreational lake. It's not all fully developed. There's some protected areas around the lake, but there's a lot of dense population in certain areas. And the lake is surrounded by dirt roads, and it really kind of exists in a bowl. So there's a lot of steep slopes surrounding Lake Wyola, and a lot of challenges with erosion on dirt roads and steep slopes. And properties are some very small properties, so that there isn't a lot of room for applicants to kind of do what they need to do in order to use their properties. They don't have a lot of space. Some of them are very tiny, kind of postage stamp size lots that used to be cottages and have been converted over. So those are some of the challenges that we've been grappling with. And there's been kind of a slow development around the lake of people converting cottages to year-round residences with an expansion of impervious surfaces, meaning there's less room for water to go where it needs to go, less infiltration space. So one of the things that we've tried to encourage is people developing vegetated buffer strips along the shoreline as a mitigation for some of the development activities. So I think that was kind of one of our thoughts with these regulations, is that, people can do the development they need to do, but we would be probably looking for some kind of mitigation in order to protect the resource areas from runoff.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And it sort of reminds me for maybe 20 years, the Corps of Engineers has had a similar, it's been a larger scale, obviously, but program as sort of a banking program, where if an applicant is on a small site where they are impacting resources, or they're impacting habitat, or something that is an important resource, but they can't mitigate it on the site, the Corps allows them to pay into a fund where they may go 10 miles in a different direction and use that money to restore impacted areas that may have been impacted 60 years ago.
Hmm.
So, you know, most towns have areas within the town, in many cases that the town controls, that need restoration, frankly. That, you know, long before we cared about any of these things, were altered and changed. And having, you know, sort of a mitigation fund of $50,000 or $100,000 is often, you know, pretty cool, because you can step in and do that. So I think that's sort of where you're heading with that possibility. But these little tiny sites, again, it just puts a huge burden on the commission to go out and look at each site and, you know, assess what can be done. Each site becomes unique. And, you know, you're adding impervious area. Can you mitigate it with some kind of subsurface infiltration? Maybe you can't. And so, you know, it's why you guys are all on the commission, right? So you can go out on your free time and walk these sites.
Yeah. Okay. Any more comments or questions from the commission? And is there anybody from the public who does want to ask a question or make a comment? I think we could probably, it's a small group, so. Not seeing any comments. Okay. The other thing we haven't really talked much about, and maybe we could have you just comment on briefly, is, you know, the provisions for protecting vernal pools.
Yeah, I will do so quickly, Marion, but I think it's a difficult topic. And I guess I can give a little perspective, perhaps.
Yeah.
I will remember being in a seminar about 4 or 5 years ago. It was being sponsored by the Association of Mass Wetland Scientists. And the keynote speaker was the head of the Natural Heritage Program, NHESP. And he was giving an address on vernal pools. And I remember he pulled up a slide showing the known or the potential vernal pools in Massachusetts. And the state was just this dartboard of red spots, red dots all over it. And I forget the number. It was like 10,000 or 15,000 of these things everywhere. And I was sort of semi-shocked, because I do a lot of vernal pool work, at his comment that there were just so many that they just weren't that important. Now I'm not telling you I agree or anything else. It was just that sort of was the NHESP take on vernal pools. So with that unhappy helicopter view of a vernal pool, they're difficult to protect because of what I said maybe an hour ago, and that's that the creatures that are dependent on them seasonally will move from the vernal pool upland an average of 1,000 feet up. I mean, there are cases of where wood frogs have been documented at a quarter mile away from the vernal pool, where they do their seasonal spring activities, and it's impossible to protect that. It's just impossible. And the 100 feet that we have as a typical provision of protection, really, unless there's a corridor, sort of a wide connectivity to an otherwise unaltered area of upland, or perhaps a riverine area or something like that. If we surround a vernal pool 100 feet away from its edge with development, it's a dead zone. I mean, you're just hearing it bluntly from somebody who does a lot of vernal pool work. So it's always important to try to create some sort of a connection, an unaltered, protected connection with the vernal pool, or they're just lost. I mean, honestly, DEP doesn't want to hear that, but it's practically it's true. I've got some vernal pools that I've been monitoring for, it's unbelievable to me, for almost 15 years, the same ones. And these are verticals that were conditioned by the commission beside condominium projects. And one of the long-term conditions was just that it be monitored for, like forever. So it's been great for me. You know, I charged dearly for it, so it's been this great stream of income. But the pools that were right beside developments have just gone completely out. They're gone. They're just dead. And the ones that have connections to wooded areas allow the species to sort of have a backdoor to come and go in. So that's sort of you know, something that you always want to look at.
Mhm. Yeah, that seems really important. And right now, because our regulations are silent about all of this, we're unable to regulate vernal pools in the same way that we might want to.
Yeah, and I'm not sure that the regulations, you know, the draft regulations that you hear really reach out much beyond what I'm describing in terms of the conventional protection. You know, it's difficult when we know that the species that depend on the pools need 800 to 1,200 feet. How do we protect them? You know, how do we do that? It's difficult. You know, again, the commissions as planning boards can sometimes steer developers, particularly if you can get a bite of the apple early on before the developer spent, you know, $75,000 developing his finished plans. If you can have those preliminary talks and say, hey, you know, we really care about this area here. We want you to create some protection around it, and here's how you can go about doing it. I'm dealing with a project in the town of Upton right now. That's a large residential project, and that's exactly where the commission steered this particular project. There was a very unique vernal pool up on top of a hill, you know, in a very unusual spot. And the developer went out of their way to be environmentally friendly, and they went 150 feet around this thing with no development. So they could come back to the commission and say, you require 100 or 150 feet out, but the whole thing was completely surrounded by roads and condominiums. So the commission basically said at the get-go, that's never going to work. We're never going to approve it. You know, we want you to create a corridor basically from the vernal pool down to nearby wetlands to allow species to go back and forth. And the developer was like, okay, and came back with complete revisions of the plans, but they weren't deeply invested at that point. It was still sort of on a, you know, discussion level. So that's just, it's a sort of an informal tool that you want to, you know, keep in your back pocket.
All right. I feel like we're kind of winding down. Are we feel like we're at a place to hold on to end on this discussion for tonight? We have the public hearing scheduled for the 21st.
Yep.
And, you know, my expectation is that there'll probably be some more revisions or edits. I found a couple of typos just after we put it up on the website. I had to take it down and put up a new version. So I'm sure there'll be more edits. And, you know, I think commissioners, if you have suggestions about condensing it, you know, there's a lot of preamble in the area, the section that talks about resource areas. Each resource area is sort of described and defined, and there's kind of a preamble, which is really a discussion of like why these particular resource areas are scientifically important. And, you know, the reason, my understanding, and Patrick, please correct me if I'm wrong, is that part of the reason for the preamble is that a commission may use those preambles in their findings. Is that often how they're
one of my early comments to you when I remember when I read the regulations in the earlier form was that the sort of scientific justification for protection was endless, and I don't necessarily mean that negatively. It was so thorough, it just went on and on. And one of my suggestions was to make sure that you're not duplicating the same justification that's built into the Wetland Protection Act for each resource area.
Mhm.
And where you are, I think you could take it out entirely and simply say, is the language I suggested some, I remember a month or two ago. But that you know, the regulation should say something to the effect that in addition in Shutesbury, and then go on about what's unique about the geography and topography in town that's different than the Wetland Protection Act, and that might allow you, if there's duplication, to you know, take out a lot of that description.
Yep. And we can also just by reference say we're adopting under these regulations and just quote the passage, the
Exactly.
citation from the regulations instead of re-quoting them all.
Yeah, exactly. And I did not go back and compare the definitions in the WPA to your regulation definitions, but that probably should be done to make sure you're not repeating.
I think the reason for doing it the way we did it was for an applicant or a landowner who might not know where to look in the state regs, having them here, if they go looking, it would sort of be a standalone document and not just, you know, because I even know that we've had this issue in the past where people have looked at our regulations, say, oh, you don't define this or that or this and that. And like, well, we adopt the WPA definitions, if so, but you know, it's not clear sometimes to people that that's what that means.
Yeah, there's a funny balance too, and I do a lot of technical writing, so I can sort of throw out to you that you know, you don't want so much information that people don't want to continue reading it. You know, it's there's a funny balance in there, but you know, you want to push all the buttons and hit the full scope of it without drowning them in information.
Mhm.
I hope I'm saying that nicely, but
No, absolutely. I mean, I think those are good points and points well taken for sure. Okay.
oh, I would go back and look at that section that defined agricultural improvements,
Mhm.
and just look at it from the point of view that if I'm a farmer and I'm reading that, anything I do is going to be an improvement, and that may not be what you mean.
Mhm. Right. So everything, so it basically exempts everything.
Yeah.
And that's a tricky issue because of the state preemption
Right.
in general.
Right. Yeah, agriculture is typically one of the more difficult areas because the state has given it such a sweeping exemption in favor of farmers. I'm not you know, saying that's good or bad. I'm just saying that's, you know, that's the way it is.
And what we've been advised is that, you know, because for agriculture, there isn't a lot of farming in Shutesbury. There are farms there. It's not a huge agricultural community, but there's a lot of forestry. And, you know, so we've been advised, and sometimes people have asked us to intervene around wetlands issues involving forest cutting plans. And we've been advised that, you know, we really have very limited jurisdiction because of the preemption. I don't know what your thoughts are about that, but
I've worked, I've reviewed a number of forestry plans, and my only reaction is that foresters know trees really well, but they don't tend to know wetlands as well, whereas they think they do. So I mean, I've gone out and reviewed plans that showed the wetlands as the forester had defined them. There were in some cases 600 and 800 feet wrong, always, you know, minimizing the wetland to the, you know, to the advantage of the upland. So, you know, that's just more of a sort of a heads up.
mhm.
Foresters, I love them all. And they tend to be good people with great intent, but their wetland expertise is not always up to the expertise of a wetland scientist.
Point taken. All right. Okay, I think we are gonna wrap up. But thank you, Patrick, and we will have you at the public hearing on the 21st.
Hopefully so. Thank you.
Great, thank you. All right. So commissioners, I think we're all done. Let me just look over the agenda now that my computer's not frozen. I think we've got everything. We did the site visits. Is there anything we've missed? Oh, yes, we did miss one thing. Tuesday night, there was the FERCog meeting and presentation at the select board meeting where they discussed the watershed-based plan. And the process, the plan is now being released to the public and it's going to be on the town website. I don't know if it's available yet for public comment. So over the summer, FERCog plans to do another site visit with the town. And so I asked that we be notified so that if we want to also participate in that site visit, we could attend.
Good.
And Mary, were you at that meeting? Yeah, did you have any thoughts?
Yes, I was. It was a very good presentation. I think it'll be helpful to the public if they put a lot of that back in. It was also very helpful that they offered help in just developing grants and things. Once we determine what we need, that they have resources that could help us. So that was very appreciative to know too.
Yeah. Yeah, they'll offer technical support for DEP stormwater grants. And there was some discussion about maybe additional studies that could be considered that might be able to be funded under the section 604B DEP grants, those planning grants. For the action grants, there's kind of planning grants, and there's action grants. And for the action grants, and I didn't know this, they often DEP wants there to be a certain level of engineering already pre-done, up to about 30% of the design. So how do you get to that 30%? How do you get that funded to do that initial design work? And they said that that can be done under a 604B planning grant or a municipal vulnerability plan grant. MVP grants can also fund that. So they also said that they're, and this will be very interesting, they're developing a toolkit for municipalities for dirt road management that they're going to be releasing sometime really soon. So like in the next week or two. So I'll pass that along when we get it. I thought that'd be interesting to hear what they put together. That could be very helpful. All right. I think we're probably done. 2-hour meeting. Not too bad, huh? Yay. And a question for the commission, how are we feeling about in the future for our Thursday night meetings? Do we want to stick with 6 o'clock? Do we want to go to 7? How's that working?
I personally like 6 o'clock.
Yeah, I think I do too. We get out a little earlier.
Yeah, I agree. You know, I just pushed dinner earlier but it's nice to end earlier.
Yeah, I appreciate I'm not sundowning. That's just a joke. By 8 o'clock, I'm still lucid. It's not past my bedtime. Okay. All right. I think we're done. Thank you.
Motion to adjourn.
And there's second.
Second.
Hey, David,
Aye.
Stefan, Harrington,
I
Khan,
Aye.
Wilson.
Aye.
All right. Good night, everybody. Thank you.
Good night.
Take care.
Thanks.
Thank
All
you.
right.